So welcome back, my dear ones, and let's start part 2 of judicial update. If you haven't gone through part 1, then just click on this I button to watch the video. Okay, so let's start with the first case law of part 2. That means actually the 10th case law of this series. It's called AA Estate Private Limited 2019 Supreme Court decision. Okay, so the case law, the circumstance, it's very clear. The High Court, without framing substantial question of law, decided an appeal based on the questions raised by the appellant. It's very simple. Say an appellant or the party who's appealing has just filed an appeal before High Court. Okay, the High Court just heard both of the parties, the appellant and the respondent. That means the person who have filed the case and the person whom against the case was filed. So the High Court heard both of the parties and decided on a particular case. So as you know, an appeal lies before High Court only if there is a substantial question of law included. There are two types of debate: legal debate and factual debate. If it is a legal debate, that means a substantial question of law involves in a particular case, then only it can be appealed before High Court. This is the general or common rule. So an appeal lies to the High Court from every order passed by the tribunal if the High Court is satisfied that the case involves a substantial question of law. As I've told you, if there is a debatable fact of law, then only it can be appealed before a High Court. And if the High Court is satisfied that a case involves a substantial question of law, then the High Court should formulate such question. So once an appeal comes before High Court, after going through the appeal and the objections, the High Court themselves have to formulate what the substantial question of law. The High Court themselves have to formulate what exactly is the debatable point of law. This is the normal provision. And the same has been provided in section 260A subsection 4. It provides that an appeal shall be heard only on the question so formulated. Question means a substantial question of law so formulated. On that question, the High Court have to hear the appeal. And section 260A subsection 5 provides that the High Court shall decide the question of law so formulated. So first, if an appeal comes before High Court, the High Court have to identify what exactly is the substantial question of law first. Then only it shall hear the case and decide on that particular appeal. This is the general rule. But here, what exactly is the problem? The debatable point was whether the High Court was justified in not formulating the substantial question of law and adjudicating merely on the questions put forth by the appellant. Simple terms we can say I'm an appellant, I filed an appeal before High Court. Okay. So what the High Court should have to be done, the High Court have to formulate a substantial question of law, right? Rather than forming a substantial question of law, what High Court did? High Court simply heard my contentions, and my opposite party, the respondent also filed his objections. So the High Court have heard both the parties, both the appellant and the respondent. Okay, and they simply said a judgment by simply hearing both of the parties. This was the thing which High Court has done. And the debatable point whether High Court has power in doing such things, because section 260A subsection 4 and subsection 5 clearly states that whenever an appeal comes before High Court, they have to formulate a substantial question of law. After formulating substantial question of law, they have to hear both of the parties. And the High Court is not simply have to decide on an appeal filed. It is not like that. They have to formulate a substantial question of law. This is what section 260A subsection 4 and subsection 5 combined together states about. But in this case, the High Court didn't formulate any substantial question of law. They simply heard both of the parties and decided judgment and said a judgment. That's what happened. So that was the debatable point whether High Court has such powers. And the Supreme Court on this case observed and judged, if the High Court is of the view that an appeal did not involve any substantial question of law, then it should have recorded the same and accordingly should have dismissed an appeal. If a case comes before High Court, the first thing that High Court has to consider whether it involves a substantial question of law. If it is not, if there is no substantial question of law, then simply dismiss the appeal. This is what the High Court should have been done. And Supreme Court also observed that. However, in this case was not done. This was not done in this case, because here it was not done. Instead, the appeal was heard only on the questions urged by the appellant. In this case, what happened? The High Court simply heard both of the parties and they decided on that particular case without formulating the substantial question of law. And the Supreme Court held that it is to be just and proper to remand the case to the High Court for deciding the appeal afresh. That means the Supreme Court held that in this case, the High Court have to reconsider that particular appeal and decide and to consider and formulate what exactly is the substantial question of law. Then they have to pronounce a judgment. This was the judgment given by the Supreme Court. Hope it's very clear, right? And let's move on to the next case law, that is called Sunil Vasudeva and others versus Sundar Gupta and others. 2019, a Supreme Court citation. Let's understand the circumstance. So while passing an order, the Calcutta High Court made an error apparent from record. So while hearing a case, the Calcutta High Court has just made an error. The error was they directed a civil suit to be pursued against the department. So the High Court has directed a civil suit initiated against the department. The High Court initiated a civil suit against the department. Under section 293 of Income Tax Act 1961, it puts a bar on filing a suit in any civil court against income tax authority. So under section 293 gives a protection to the department, because if some action is done by the department, based on that action, no assessee or no person is supposed to file a civil suit against the department, because department has done their duty, right? Suppose department has sent me a notice, okay, say income escapement notice or something, and I'm filing a case against department that department is simply trouble me or something. Then section 293 of Income Tax Act gives a protection to the department, right? And what is the protection? It puts a complete bar on filing in any civil suit against an income tax authority. So it just gives a protection from civil suits for the department, right? And what happened is the said order was recalled for the review and error was corrected. So the High Court, without considering 293, initiated a civil case against the department, because under section 293 it puts a bar, a protection to the department, right? So once the High Court realized that there was an error, what High Court recalled the entire order or recalled the entire proceedings, and the error was corrected. The High Court called everything back and the error was corrected, and the new judgment was according to section 293 of Income Tax Act 1961. And here the debatable point is whether High Court is justified in recalling and reviewing its order to correct an apparent error. It simply says whether High Court has power. The debatable point is very simple, whether the High Court has power to recall its order and to rectify the mistake. Is it within the jurisdiction or within the power of a High Court? That was the debatable point in this particular case. And let's understand the Supreme Court observations and judgment. It's very simple. Under section 293, section 293 was mistakenly omitted by the High Court while passing an order directing pursuance of a civil suit against the department. So Supreme Court observed that section 293 was misinterpreted by the High Court. That's why High Court initiated a civil case against the department. Okay, and accordingly, the said order was recalled for review and error apparent was corrected. That's why the High Court recalled their entire order and the error was corrected, right? And the Supreme Court held that the High Court was justified in arriving at a conclusion that there appeared to be an error apparent on the face of record and reviewing its earlier judgment in exercise of its review jurisdiction. And the Supreme Court held that. Hence, the Supreme Court held that in this case, the High Court has recalled its entire order only for rectifying the mistake which they have considered under section 293 of Income Tax Act, right? Because if they have correctly interpreted 293 of Income Tax Act, they shouldn't initiate a civil proceedings against the department. So they have initiated a civil proceedings against the department. That's why they have recalled the order and cancelled the order and rectified on account of mistake. And thus, Supreme Court held that in this case, it is well within the power and jurisdiction of High Court to rectify a mistake committed. And that is what the judgment. Got my point? So let's move forward and understand the next case law, that is called Eurotech Maritime Academy Private Limited 2019 Kerala High Court decision. And let's understand the circumstance. Starting with the SSE at West, registered under 12AA. Again, as I've told you in part 1, the registration proceedings have been amended and a new provision 12AB has been inserted. Again, if you haven't watched that video, then I have done a separate playlist on the new 12AB. Okay, and let's continue with the case. It is under 12AA, paid rent for the building occupied. So the SSE was a trust, they occupied in a building and they were paying rent. Okay, And assessing officer found that the TDS by the assessee was deposited belatedly and imposed a penalty under 271C of Income Tax Act 1961, which was equal to the amount of tax payable. And the department found that the assessee, while depositing the rent, haven't paid TDS, haven't deducted TDS or deducted TDS, which was deposited belatedly. That's why the department has imposed a penalty against the assessee under section 271C equal to the amount of income tax payable. That was the amount of penalty. And the assessee contended that it was a trust registered under 12AA and therefore not obliged to carry out an audit under 44AB. So assessee's contention, it was a trust and they are not obliged to carry out an audit under 44AB of Income Tax Act. Only those persons covered under 44AB would have to deduct tax under 194I. That means TDS for rent. Okay. So assessee's contention was very simple. Assessee says we are a trust and we are not supposed to carry out any tax audit. Under section 194I, those assessees who are required to be carry out tax audit in the previous financial year is only required to deduct TDS under section 194I in the relevant previous year. This was the contention of assessee. Okay, and the assessee objected the penalty under section 271CY because under 194I, assessee's contention was under 194I, we are not required to deduct what? TDS, and hence TDS penalty will not be applicable to us. This was the contention raised by the assessee. And now the High Court observations and judgment. Let's understand whether the contention raised by the assessee is right or not. Okay, the High Court observations and judgment is very simple. It says the trust cannot be included within the definition of an individual or HUF, right? The trust is not an individual, it is not an HUF. And therefore, the monetary limit specified under 44AB is not relevant in this case. Why? Because under section 194I, there is a relaxation. For individual and HUF, they are required to deduct TDS only if they have to carry out a tax audit in the preceding financial year. If they have to carry out a tax audit in the preceding financial year, then in the next financial year, they have to deduct TDS under 194I while paying what? Rent. Okay, and assessee being a trust cannot be called as an individual or HUF, right? And accordingly, the High Court held that the assessee is liable to pay penalty under 271C for both non-deduction of tax at source and non-remittance of tax at source. Why? Because the assessee is liable to deduct tax at source irrespective of whether or not it was covered under 44AB, right? Assessee is a trust, it is not an individual, not an HUF. So the relaxation of the tax audit 44AB is not applicable to the assessee. The assessee's entire contention was wrong. And the High Court held that in this case, assessee is liable to deduct TDS under 194I because it is not an individual, not an HUF. And 44AB will not come into the picture itself. So the assessee deducted the TDS, but deposited it belatedly, right? Both have been done belatedly. So 271C penalty is applicable for assessee. This was the judgment given by the High Court. And in the case of Eurotech Maritime Private Limited, and it was held in 2019. Hope you got that case as well. And let's move on to the next case, that is called Lakshman Das Khandelwal 2019 Supreme Court decision. In this case, let's understand the circumstance. The issue of notice under 143 subsection 2 is mandatory for making a regular assessment under 143 subsection 3. 143 subsection 3 assessment procedure chapter, it states about what a regular assessment, right? For invoking a regular assessment, department is mandatorily required to issue a notice under section 143.2 to the assessee, just like an intimating the assessee. And there is one more section that is called 292BB. It says that where assessee has participated in any proceedings and assessment order is issued, any notice which is required to be served upon him shall be deemed to have been duly served, and the assessee would be precluded from taking any objection that the notice was not served upon him or not served upon him in time or served upon him in an improper manner. Because section 292BB, it states that suppose I've got a notice which is after the expiry time, say belated notice. The normal time limit for notice is 6 months from the end of the year in which the income was first assessable. This was the act says. Okay, so the normal time limit for sending the notice is 6 months. Say for example, I got a notice after 6 months. So the notice, we can say it is barred by time, BARRAD, barred by time, right? So if a notice is barred by time, okay, then I can say the entire proceedings against that particular notice is what? Invalid. Why? Because only after issuing a proper valid time within time limit notice, department can initiate a proceedings against me. Got my point? But section 292BB says, suppose I got a notice which was after the time limit, which was expired or barred by time, and I've cooperated to the proceedings after receiving that notice without checking the time limit. I have cooperated with the department, and the assessment is over because against me, say the department has issued an assessment order as well. After receiving assessment order, I have realized what the notice was barred by time. If it is like so, then I cannot object the validity of notice. Why? Because you have cooperated with the proceedings. The proceedings is already over because the assessment order is against you. Assessment order is already issued against you. Thereafter, you cannot question the validity of notice. This is what 292BB says. Hope it's clear. I got a time barred notice. Without noticing it, I have cooperated with the proceedings. The proceedings is already over. I got the assessment order. Thereafter, I cannot question the validity of notice. This is what 292BB says. And let's understand the debatable point in this case. It says the debatable point here is whether assessing officer's omission to issue notice under 143(2) is a defect curable under 292BB in spite of participation by the assessee in assessment proceedings. This was the debatable point in this case. So it says the debatable point is whether assessing officer's omission to issue notice under 143(2) is a defect curable under 292BB. In this case, there was no notice. The department haven't issued any notice in this case. Okay, but the assessee somehow came to know about what? The proceedings against the assessee. So even without a notice, assessee has cooperated to the proceedings and the proceedings is already over. Okay, thereafter assessee came to realize that there was no notice in this case. Okay, there was no notice in this case and the assessee objected the proceedings against the assessee under 143 subsection 3 because there was no notice. And the assessing officer said, according to 292BB, the proceedings is already over. Then you cannot question the validity of notice. Hope you got the debate. The assessee's debate what? There was no notice. Okay. And the department's contention was, you have cooperated to the proceedings and the proceedings is already over. Now you cannot question the validity of the notice. This is what the contention of department. So they went into a debate. Now let's understand the Supreme Court observations and judgments. The Supreme Court observed that for section 292BB to apply, the notice must have been emanated from the department. For 292BB to come into the picture, there should be a notice, whether it is time barred or whatever it is, but there should be a notice. Then only you can take the protection or the benefit of 292BB. This was the observation made by the Supreme Court. And it is not only the defect in the manner of service of notice that the section seeks to cure. The section is not intended to cure a complete absence of notice itself. Supreme Court, highlighted that only if there is a notice, then 292BB will come into the picture. If there is some defect in the notice which is served, then only 292BB will come into the picture. You cannot take the benefit of 292BB without sending a notice. That was the observation given by the Supreme Court, and hence Supreme Court held that the non-issuance of notice under section 143 subsection 2 is not a curable defect under 292BB. Without issuing a notice, department cannot say that 292BB will come into the picture, because for 292BB to get invoked, there should be at least the notice. Okay, and in spite of participation by the assessee in the assessment proceedings. So this judgment was in favor of assessee, because there was no notice. So 292BB will not come into the picture. There should be some notice for invoking 292BB. This was the observation given by the Supreme Court. Hope it is clear. Now let's move on to the next case law, that's called Ivan Interactive Limited Supreme Court 2019 decision. Now let's understand the circumstances of this case. So the assessee participated in an assessment proceedings. However, the assessee challenged the notice under section 143 subsection 2 on the ground that the said notice was not served upon him on time. Okay, so assessee participated in the proceedings. Okay, after participation, the assessee contended that a notice which was required to be issued under 143 subsection 2 was not issued in time. Okay, that was the contention of assessee. Subsequent notices were served and received by the company were beyond the period of limitation prescribed under section 143 of the Act. And the AO not accepted the contention of assessee. Okay, and the assessing officer did not accepted the contention of SSC, so they went into a debate, and the debate went before Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's observations and judgment. It says that the Supreme Court held that mere mentioning of a new address in the return of income is not enough. In change of address, if change of address is not specifically intimated to the AO, he is justified in sending the notice at an address mentioned in the PAN database. And the Supreme Court held that if the notice is sent within the period prescribed in section 143 subsection 2, actual service of notice upon the SSC is immaterial. And I hope that you didn't get anything, and I will explain this case law by way of a simple example. For example, say JK. Okay, JK has a PAN number, and JK's address in PAN number is, say, Maharashtra. Okay, and my address in PAN number is, say, not Maharashtra, say Mumbai. We'll take Mumbai. My address in PAN number was Mumbai. Okay, so while filing return with the department, JK has given a new address because JK got moved from Mumbai to, say, Kolkata. Okay, so Mumbai to Calcutta. So in my return, I have given a new address which is of Kolkata. Okay, and I've given this new address to the AO while filing the return. AO send a notice in the address which is mentioned in PAN, that is to Mumbai. Okay, and the notice was served there. In my Mumbai residence, notice was there. But currently I am in Calcutta. So I contended that I didn't get a notice. Subsequently, AO served a second notice to Calcutta. And the second notice was actually barred by time, BARRAD, barred by time. Okay, and the second notice under 143 subsection 2 was barred by time. So the SSC said the notice which I got in my new address was barred by time. So 143 subsection 3, the entire proceedings against me is invalid. That was the contention of SSC. And the Supreme Court in this case observed that the assessing officer did everything right, because the assessing officer has initially sent a within time period notice, which is valid in the address given in PAN, because that is the only address which AO have. Mere mentioning the new address in return of income is not necessary, because in this case, assessing officer has served a proper notice in time in the address which has been provided in the PAN. So there was no default from the assessing officer, and hence SSC cannot say the second notice which is issued to the Calcutta is barred by time, and entire proceedings is valid. That was the contention of Supreme Court in this particular case, and this decision is in favor of the department. Got my point? So let's move on to the next case, that is called Harjeet Suryaprakash Girotra versus UOI Mumbai bench. It's a Bombay High Court decision, 2019 cited decision. And in this case, the assessee was an individual, had never filed return of income since she does not have any taxable income. So assessee did not file any return of income, and her contention was she have no taxable income. So she didn't file any return of income. The assessing officer issued a reopening notice against the assessee on the ground that during the relevant period, the assessee has entered into various high value transactions. So the assessing officer monitored certain high value transactions from the side of assessee, and the assessing officer sent a reopening notice, income escapement notice, which is under section 148. It is a reassessment notice against the assessee. The said notice was dispatched for delivery through post, and it was returned by the postal authority. So the department has sent a notice to the SSC under 148 of Income Tax Act 1961, but the notice got returned stating that there was no the person was not there, so the notice got returned by the department. Okay, so the postal authority has returned the notice. But what happened is the department took no further steps. On the basis of the notice and the postal dispatch, assessing officer carried on assessment and made additions to the income of the assessee. In this case, a notice has been issued, but the issued notice returned back to the department. Why? Because there was no addressee. Okay, but even after that, department initiated a proceedings against the assessee because a notice was issued. It was not served, it came back. So the department initiated a proceedings against the SSC when the delivery of a notice could not be made at an address of SSC available in PAN database by virtue of proviso to sub rule 2 of Rule 127 of income tax rules, communication have to be delivered at a new address of the assessee or at an alternative address of the assessee as available with a banking company. Because in the return or say there will be addresses with the banking company. Okay, so if the initial return address, okay, if that particular notice is not served to the initial return address and the notice came back, then as per Rule 127 and Sub Rule 2, a notice have to be issued in some another alternate address which is available with the department. This is what the income tax rule states about. And in this case, the assessee debated, because assessee says that I didn't get any notice. Okay, in my old address or new address, whatever it is, I didn't get any notice. So assessee said that the entire proceedings against me is invalid. And the High Court observed that before making reassessment under 147, the assessing officer had to serve on the assessee a notice requiring him to furnish a return. And the service of notice is necessary and not its mere issuance. In this case, notice was not issued. Okay, sorry, notice was actually issued, but it was not served to the assessee because it returned. Okay, and the assessing officer, once the notice got returned, have to issue a new notice. Okay, have to issue a new notice in an alternative address. In an alternative address which is actually available with the department. This was the Rule 127 of income tax rules. And where the reopening notice was where reopening notice was returned by postal authorities, the communication have to be made at an address of the assessee as available with the banking company. Because with the banking company details, assessing officer anyways have the details of banking company. So there will be some other alternative addresses. Then the assessing officer have to find out that address and must send a new notice, because a notice have to be served to the assessee. Okay. Since the revenue had failed to do so, there was no service of reopening notice, and thus the subsequent assessment order making additions to the income of the assessee was unjustified. Don't confuse with Harjeet case law and Ivan Interactive Limited case law. In Ivan Interactive, that means in the previous case law which we have discussed, a notice was initially served in the old address. So as per the assessment sections, a notice was served in the first case. In which case, in Ivan Interactive Limited Supreme Court case, a notice was served. But in the next case, that is Harjeet Suryaprakash Girotra, in this case, a notice was not even served. It got returned. That's why the High Court decision was in favor of assessee. Got my point? So don't confuse with the Ivan Interactive Limited Supreme Court case law and Harjeet Suryaprakash Girotra case law, because the circumstances in both of the case law is different. That's why different judgments came in. Got my point? Again, moving forward with the next case law, that is called Peerless General Finance and Investment Company Limited, Supreme Court decision, and it is cited in 2019. And the assessee, being an investment company, had floated various collective investment schemes which require subscribers to deposit certain amounts by way of subscription. So assessee was basically an investment company. So it invited different subscribers to invest in by way of some deposits to that particular company. Okay, and depending upon the scheme in question, these subscribed amounts at the end of the schemes were ultimately repaid with interest to the depositors. It is just like a banking investment. Once you've invested in my company, and I will give back this investment with interest after a certain period of time. This was the basic business of the assessee. Okay, and the scheme also contained a clause that if in midway a certain amount was forfeited by any of the depositors, then the said amount would immediately become income in the hands of the assessee. It simply means, say I've started an investment scheme. Say for example, it is for 5 years. Okay, for the 5 years, every month I have to deposit certain sum of money till the end of 5 years. After the end of 5 years, I will return the entire invested amount with interest. This was the scheme, for example. And if an assessee started investing, say small amounts, small proportion of amounts in that particular deposit, once he started the deposit scheme, thereafter he forfeited. Say the first year I've deposited the month as per the installment schedule, and in the second year I've made a default. Then what happens? Then my entire deposit will get forfeited. This was the rule of that investment deposit scheme. Okay, so if in midway, if any person makes a default, then the entire deposit scheme got forfeited and the company will not give back anything to the depositor. This was the scheme. Okay, that's why if some person makes a default, that entire amount will be income of that particular investment company. Okay, And the assessee treated all the subscription receipts, all the subscribed receipts as income in the books of accounts. Assessee mistakenly, what he did, he have considered every deposit as his income in the books of accounts. However, any of such schemes were never been forfeited by the subscribers, and none of the subscribers forfeited any of the scheme. Everything was correctly paid. But even after that, assessee shown in books of accounts for his convenience as income. These deposits were shown as income. Okay. And then what happened, the department will definitely treat it as income of the assessee, and the assessee will say, this is only for the convenience, we have shown this as our, income in books of accounts. It is actually not our income. This was the debate. And the case went to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court observations and judgments, and the character of the transaction being clearly a capital receipts, right? Say, imagine a bank. It get capital from different fixed deposit or savings bank accounts, etc. And these deposits are not what income of the bank. They are utilizing the deposits to give away what loans, right? So these deposits are only in capital nature in the hands of the assessee. Could not possibly be taxed as income in the assessee's hands, even though the assessee had in its books of accounts shown this sum as an income. Even if the assessee had shown these as income, these are not your income. It is only a part of capital. This was the observation made by the Supreme Court. And hence, the subscription receipt from public at large under collective investment schemes floated by the assessee company constitute capital receipts and hence not taxable. This was the judgment given by the Supreme Court, and this judgment was in favor of assessee. Even though it has been shown as income in the books of accounts for the convenience of assessee, you cannot treat it as income because it is only a capital receipt. That was the judgment given by the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's continue with the next case law, that is called P.P. Mahatme, Bombay High Court decision, and it is cited in 2019. Let's understand this case. So, Lorna Margaret Pinto, we will call her as LMP for the sake of convenience. This is a big name, so we will call her as LMP. Okay, was an NRI. So, whenever I say LMP, that means a person. Okay, and her real name is Lorna Margaret Pinto. Okay, say LMP is an NRI. Okay, and LMP was one of the co-owners of an immobile property, and LMP was also a co-owner of an immobile property. And this LMP has given a power of attorney to the assessee acting as an agent in India. So basically, there was an NRI, okay, and there was an agent who acts as an, there was an assessee, or there was a person who acts as an agent of this NRI. Okay, under section 163 of Income Tax Act, it is possible this agent will be assessed for the income earned by the NRI. This is what happens under 163. And what happens is this NRI has given a power of attorney to the agent acting in India. Okay, then what happens? The other co-owners illegally acquired the co-owned property. So there were this an LMP was one of the co-owner of an immobile property, and the other co-owners illegally acquired that particular immobile property from the hands of our NRI. Okay, and pursuant to settlement in a civil suit filed by the LMP, our NRI received certain amount as consideration towards her share in the property. So the NRI filed a case in the against the co-owners by a civil suit, and ultimately NRI got some consideration, or say some compensation for the illegal acquisition made by the co-owners. So she got some amount. Okay, and what happened is AO issued a reopening notice under 148 against the assessee, because the assessee is the person who acts as an agent for this NRI for whatever income earned by the NRI in India, right? So even though he's an NRI, the immobile property is in India, and hence whatever income earned from that immobile property is deemed to be accrued or rise in India, right? So assessee acting as an agent in India of that particular NRI, against this assessee, department has issued a notice for reopening, or income escapement assessment. Okay, and on the ground that the aforesaid amount received by LMP was taxable as capital gain. So the contention of department was very simple. While sending a notice to the assessee, the department's contention is your principal, that NRI got some payment in relation to an immobile property, and this payment is taxable under capital gain. That was the contention of the department or the assessing officer. Okay, then what happened? Assessee said that this is not a taxable under capital gain. The assessee's contention was there was a family settlement in which impugned amount in question was received, and the same is not subjected to capital gain tax. So the SSC's contention was very clear. SSC said this is not taxable under capital gain. Why? Because it is a family settlement. That's why it has not been taxable under capital gain. And in support to his contention, in support to SSC's contention, SSC referred a Supreme Court case law in the case of Mahuri Palaya versus Mathuri Narasimhan. It was held that there is no transfer of assets in a family arrangement and the amount received by the SSC is a part of family arrangement and not towards the transfer of any capital asset, and such amount cannot be regarded as a capital gain and no capital gain tax liability arises. So this judgment was given by the Supreme Court in the case, in an earlier case, which has been given by Mahuri Palaya versus Mathuri Narasimhan. And what was the judgment? On account of a family settlement or arrangement, if some amount received by any SSCs, then it cannot be assessed under capital gain, because Supreme Court says that it is not on account of any transfer of capital asset. It is purely on account of what? Family settlement, and hence it is not taxable in the hands of SSC. This was the earlier judgment given by the Supreme Court, and this judgment has been mentioned by our SSC in favorable to his contention, right? And in this case, the High Court observed that merely because the said dispute regarding immobile property involves some family members and such dispute was ultimately settled by filing consent terms could not be treated as family settlement. Merely by for example, say there were some co-owners in a property and the co-owners illegally acquired the property, and against the co-owners our SSC has filed a petition in a civil court, and the co-owners has given some compensation and they have settled the case. Okay, this cannot be called as a family settlement. Merely there are some co-owners, you cannot treat it as a family settlement. What is a family settlement? If there is a hereditary property and if there are relatives, okay, if on account of a hereditary property, if there are some debate on account of legal title between relatives, then it only can be called as a family settlement. This was a co-owned property. This was simply a purchase or a co-owned property by different persons and they are relatives. That doesn't mean it is a family settlement. This was the observation given by the High Court. Hope it is clear. And hence the sum received on account of settlement of the property taken by the relatives was taxable as capital gain. Simply we can say, if that NRI's fathers, if that property was NRI's fathers and it got inherited by the NRI and the co-owners, then the entire scenario changes. Then it can be called as a family settlement. And in this case, it was not like that. There were some co-owners and they were relatives. That doesn't mean always it is a family settlement. Got my point? And hence the High Court held that this entire amount was taxable as capital gain. And let's move on to the next case law, that is called Swastik Safe Deposit and Investments Limited. It was again Bombay High Court decision in 2019. And SSC sold some shares of a company. SSC sold some shares and contended that it is exempted under 1038. Earlier there was an exemption under section 1038 of Income Tax Act stating that if it is a long-term capital gain on account of transfer of a listed share, then it was purely 100% exempted earlier. And February 2018, from February 2018 onwards, or from Feb 2018 annual budget, 1038 was revoked and a new section under 112A was introduced. Okay, and now currently, if there is a long-term capital gain on account of transfer of a listed share, then over and above 1 lakh will be subjected to tax at 10% under section 112A of Income Tax Act 1961. This is the new provision, and this case law was related to the earlier provision which was mentioned under 1038 of Income Tax Act. And again, being held for more than 12 months, and this transaction was subjected to STT. That's what called transfer of a listed share. And SSC sold some shares of a listed company and it was exempted under 1038 earlier. Okay, and SSC, the AO issued a reopening notice on the ground that though capital gain from sale of shares were exempted from tax, but SSC had failed to disclose the receipt on sale of shares in return of income, which would amount to escapement of income chargeable to tax. So what happened? There was an exempted income. Okay, in very simple term, there was an exempted income. And the SSC did not disclose that information related to the exempted income in the return. And the SSC filed this return. Okay, and the assessing officer wants to reopen that particular case under 147, stating that there was an exempted income and the same has not been disclosed in the return of income. That's why there is an escapement. This was the contention of assessing officer. Even though it is a escaped, or even though it is an exempted income, it have to be disclosed. That's what the contention of AO. It is not disclosed, hence there is an income escapement. That was the contention of department. Okay. And the High Court observation and judgment, High Court held that mere non-disclosure of receipt of gain on sale of shares, which was already exempted for income tax, would not automatically imply escapement of income, right? You cannot call this as an escapement income, even if that assessee has shown it in return. This is purely 100% exempted. Then how can it be an exempted income? That's what the observation raised by, or the judgment given by the High Court. And chargeable to tax from the assessment to reopen the assessment. It simply says that it is an exempted income. So whether, suppose the assessee haven't shown it in return, you cannot call it as an exempted income. You cannot call it as an escaped income. Why? Because it is an exempted income. Am I confusing you? It is very simple. It is an exempted income. Okay. So hence there is no escapement of income. Why? Because anyways it is exempted, whether it is disclosed in return or not, it is exempted. So you cannot call it as an escapement of income, and that's what the judgment given by the High Court. Hope it is clear. And that is the end of this part 1 and part 2 series of Judicial Update. Thank you for watching the video, and take care, and bye bye, and all the very best for your examination. Stay blessed.